His mother chose a princess for him, but the Duke could only think about the farmer's daughter. Winter arrived at Ashenfell that year the way an old debt arrives. Quietly at first and then, all at once, refusing to leave. The frost climbed the mullioned windows of the great house like a slow hand tracing an old grievance. The chimneys smoked as if remembering better fires. The trees along the North Avenue stood black against a sky the color of bone, and the wind moved through the eaves with the patience of a creditor who knows he will be paid. Down in the low fields, past the last stone wall of the estate, past the crooked oak with the broken branch that had never been cut away, the same wind lifted the hem of a plain gray dress and set it whispering against a pair of chapped, careful hands. Nora Ashcombe did not notice. She had counted the eggs, mended the henhouse door, carried the pail of milk to the stone shelf in the pantry, wiped the frost from the sill, and coaxed a stubborn ember back to life in the kitchen hearth before her father had even set his boots on the mat. She had done these things not because anyone asked and not because anyone thanked her, but because someone had to, and no one else in the small tenant cottage of Ashcombe seemed to remember that things did not do themselves. Her sister Prudence sat at the kitchen table in a ribbon-tied cap she had bought with the last of the market money and read aloud from a borrowed novel about a girl who married a viscount. Her mother, Mrs. Ashcombe, sat opposite Prudence with her sewing loose in her lap and her eyes fixed on some distant, imagined drawing room where Prudence, not Nora, was being handed a cup of chocolate by a footman in livery. Her father sat by the fire with a farmer's ledger open on his knee, mouthing figures under his breath, and did not look up when Nora came in from the yard. Nora set the milk on the shelf. She hung her shawl on the peg. She washed her hands in the cold basin and dried them on the rough cloth by the door. Then she took her place at the corner of the table, where the light did not fall, and reached for the bread and knife. "She does move about, doesn't she?" Mrs. Ashcombe said, as if Nora were a draft. "I hardly know she's in the house." "That's because she's always outside," Prudence said, without looking up. "That's because she's useful," their father said, still mouthing figures. Nora sliced the bread. She did not answer. She had learned, by the small quiet degrees that make up a life, that answering only extended the conversation, and the conversation was never about her. Autumn had turned into winter. Winter would turn into spring. There would be lambing and shearing and the great planting and the small planting and the market days and the assessments from the estate, and there would be Prudence's ribbons, and her mother's imagined drawing rooms, and her father's ledger, and there would be Nora, unnoticed, at the corner of the table where the light did not fall. She was 22 years old. She had a face that people would have called pretty if they had looked at it, and hands that people would have called capable if they had watched them work. She had dark hair pinned plainly under a plain cap. She had gray eyes that took in more than she said. She wore a gray dress because gray did not show the mud, and because gray, she had discovered, made her almost invisible even inside her own house. She preferred it that way. Invisible people were not asked to make excuses. Invisible people were not measured against princesses. Invisible people were left, most of the time, alone. 200 miles to the south, in a paneled study lined with books and maps and the small dark portraits of men who had done well and been remembered for it, the invisibility of a farmer's daughter did not yet signify. But it would. The Duke of Ashenfell sat in a straight-backed chair with his hands folded on his knee and listened to his mother speak of princesses. His name was Alaric Danvers, 7th Duke of Ashenfell, master of a house whose chimneys had begun to smoke that morning 200 miles to the north. He was 30 years old and looked, at that moment, considerably older. He had a lean, close-shaven face with a straight nose and a mouth that had learned early to say nothing. He had dark hair cut close and combed back without vanity. He had gray eyes that were, at that moment, fixed on the small fire in the grate as if the fire had a proposition he was considering. He was dressed in a plain dark coat and buff breeches and boots without ornament. He wore no ring. He carried no cane. He was a man who had inherited a title 6 years earlier and had spent every day since discovering that titles, unlike estates, did not pay their own bills. "Her name is Isabeau," his mother was saying, from the sofa opposite. "The eldest daughter of the Prince of Vaudreuil, 20 years old, perfectly educated. She reads Latin. She rides. She sings, not brilliantly, but pleasantly, which is better. Her dowry would clear the mortgage on the North Estate, the whole of your father's debts, and leave enough to re-roof Ashenfell besides. There is not another match in Europe like it. And she has, I am told, been raised with the expectation that she will marry a duke. She said the word duke as if she were closing a lid on a jewel box. Alaric did not look up from the fire. You have not spoken, his mother said. I have not been asked a question. You are being asked one now. He did look up then. His mother, the Dowager Duchess of Ashenfell, sat very straight on the sofa in a gown of dove-gray silk with a black lace shawl arranged across her shoulders. She had been beautiful in her youth and was formidable now. She had buried a husband, a brother, and a great many illusions, and had emerged from each burial more precisely herself. She loved her son as she loved the estate, with an unsentimental fierceness that permitted no other loyalties. I have not said no, Alaric said. You have not said yes. I have not met her. You will meet her at Ashenfell in the spring. She will travel with her aunt and a small retinue. She will stay 3 weeks. If, at the end of the 3 weeks, you are still capable of finding fault with a princess whose dowry would save the house your father nearly ruined, you will tell me so, and I will bear it. Until then, I will proceed on the assumption that the 7th Duke of Ashenfell has not forgotten what he owes his name. Alaric folded his hands more tightly on his knee. I have not forgotten, he said quietly. I have never been allowed to. Good, said his mother. Then it is settled. It was not settled. It was, in the way of these things, only spoken. But she was a woman who understood that the difference between speaking a thing and settling it was often only patience, and she had a great deal of patience. She rose. She crossed the room. She laid one gloved hand briefly against her son's cheek, the only tenderness she permitted herself in him, and he did not turn his head to accept it. Then she left him alone in the paneled study with the fire and the small dark portraits of men who had done well and been remembered for it. He sat a long time. He did not, in his mind, see a princess. He did not, in his mind, see the North Estate or the mortgage or the re-roofing. He did not, in his mind, see the drawing rooms and the singing and the Latin. He saw, instead, without knowing why, a girl in a gray dress at the corner of a table where the light did not fall. He had never seen her. He had no reason to see her. He had spent the last 4 years managing his estates through stewards and letters and the occasional grim visit, and he had, so far as he could remember, never once turned his eyes toward the tenant cottages of the low fields at Ashcombe. But 4 months earlier, in autumn, on the one grim visit he had made that year, he had ridden out at dusk with a young steward at his side to look at a boundary dispute, and the road had taken them past the low fields, past the crooked oak with the broken branch, and past a cottage door where a girl in a gray dress had been carrying a pail of milk across a frozen yard. She had not seen him. He had been on horseback some way off and she had been intent on the pail. But he had seen her. The plain gray dress, the plain cap, the careful hands, and the way she had paused, once, in the middle of the yard, and lifted her face to the sky as if listening for something no one else had heard. Then she had gone into the cottage, and the door had closed behind her, and the young steward had said something about drainage. Alaric had ridden on. He had thought no more about it that night. But in the weeks since, at odd moments, over a ledger, over a decanter, in the pause between one letter and the next, the picture had returned. The gray dress, the pale, the upward lifted face. He did not know her name. He did not, until that afternoon in his mother's paneled study, know that he had been thinking about her at all. But when his mother said the word princess, what came into his mind was not a princess. What came into his mind was a girl who had lifted her face to a winter sky in a frozen yard, and who had, without knowing it, been seen. He rose. He crossed to the fire. He stood a long moment with his hands behind his back. Then he sent for his valet, ordered his travel case packed, and asked quietly that a plain suit of clothes, the sort a land agent might wear, brown coat, buff breeches, no ring, no crest, be included on top. He did not tell his mother. The following week, in the small tenant cottage of Ashcombe, a letter arrived that no one had expected. It was not addressed to Nora. Nothing was ever addressed to Nora. It was addressed to her father, John Ashcombe, tenant of the Low Fields, and it bore the seal of the estate office. Her father broke the seal at the kitchen table with the same slow care he broke everything, and read the letter twice, and then a third time, and then set it down on the table between the bread and the butter and did not speak. "Well," said Mrs. Ashcombe. "They are sending a new land agent," her father said, "to take over the assessment of the low fields. He will lodge with us for the season." "Lodge with us? Here? There is no inn near enough. He is a young man. The estate office writes that he is quiet and gives no trouble. They ask that we house him, board him, and treat him as one of the family. The rent will be reduced accordingly." "Reduced by how much?" Her father named a figure. Her mother sat back in her chair. "That is a great deal of reduction for one lodger." "He is the Duke's man," her father said. "Perhaps the Duke is generous." "Perhaps the Duke has never been to a farmhouse," her mother said. "One extra plate. One extra bed. Where is he to sleep?" "He can have the back room," said Prudence promptly, "if he is a gentleman. It has the window over the garden. I shall lend him one of my books." "He is not a gentleman," her father said without looking up. "He is a land agent." "He might be a gentleman by manner," Prudence said, undeterred. "One never knows." Nora, at the corner of the table where the light did not fall, cut a slice of bread and said nothing. She had already, in her mind, made the back room ready. She had already, in her mind, aired the linens, swept the floor, laid a small fire in the tiny grate, and set a jug of water on the washstand. She had already decided, without being asked, that the lodger, whoever he was, would be no trouble because she would make sure of it. It did not occur to her to wonder whether the lodger, in turn, would be trouble for her. He arrived 4 days later, in the plain brown coat and buff breeches of a land agent, on a plain bay horse, with a single traveling case behind his saddle. He tied the horse himself at the gatepost. He carried the case himself to the door. He knocked, quietly, and when Mrs. Ashcombe opened the door, he removed his hat and bowed to her, not deeply, but correctly, in a way she felt without being able to name. "Mrs. Ashcombe, my name is Danvers. The estate office writes that I am expected. You are Mr. Danvers." "Come in, come in. You've had a long ride." "Not so long. Thank you." He stepped into the small front room. He was taller than her father. He was leaner than Prudence had imagined. He had a lean, close-shaven face and dark hair combed back without vanity and gray eyes that took in the room without appearing to look at it. He wore no ring. He carried no cane. He was, so far as anyone in the room could tell, exactly what the estate office had written him to be. Nora, coming in from the yard with the empty milk pail, stopped short in the doorway. He looked at her. He looked at her for perhaps 2 seconds. It was not the 2 seconds of a man looking at a stranger. It was the 2 seconds of a man recognizing something he had already, without knowing it, been looking for. She did not know that. She would not know that for a long time. All she knew in that moment was that a strange gentleman in a brown coat was standing in her mother's front room, and that his gray eyes, when they met hers, did not slide past her the way eyes usually did. "This is my daughter Nora," her mother said. "Nora, Mr. Danvers, from the estate office. He is to lodge with us." "Mr. Danvers," Nora said, and dropped a small, plain curtsy. Her hands, she noticed, were red from the cold. She hid them, without thinking, in the folds of her gray dress. "Miss Ashcombe," he said. His voice was low and even. "I hope I do not put you to too much trouble." "You do not," she said, and meant it, because trouble was a thing she had long since stopped counting. He inclined his head to her. Then his eyes moved on, over her mother, over Prudence emerging from the kitchen with a fresh ribbon in her cap, over her father rising slowly from his chair by the fire, and he gave each of them, in turn, the same correct, quiet bow. But she felt his eyes come back to her, once, as her mother led him toward the stairs. And she felt, without understanding why, that she had been seen. She turned quickly to the pantry. She hung the milk pail on its hook. She pressed her red, chapped hands together for a moment in the cold dark of the pantry, and did not know why her heart was beating so hard. 200 miles to the south, in a paneled study lined with books and maps, the Dowager Duchess of Ashenfell wrote a letter to the Prince of Vaudrey, expressing her son's warm anticipation of receiving the Princess Isabeau at Ashenfell in the spring. She sealed the letter with the ducal seal. She sent it by the fastest post. She poured herself a small glass of sherry and drank it standing by the window, watching the frost climb the mullioned glass, and she did not know, because there was no reason for her to know, that her son had, that afternoon, arrived at a tenant cottage in the low fields of Ashcombe wearing a brown coat and calling himself Mr. Danvers. She would find out. But not yet. For now autumn had turned to winter. Winter would turn to spring. And in a small tenant cottage where the light did not fall on the corner of the table, a farmer's daughter in a gray dress had, without knowing it, been seen. The first week was quiet. Mr. Danvers rose early, earlier than Prudence, earlier than Mrs. Ashcombe, earlier even than John Ashcombe, who had risen before dawn every day of his adult life. Nora found him in the yard before first light on the second morning, splitting kindling at the block by the woodshed. He had taken off his coat and rolled his sleeves to the elbow. His forearms were leaner than a farmer's but corded with a kind of strength that surprised her. He handled the axe as if he had handled one before. "Mr. Danvers," she said, from the doorway. "You need not do that." He set the axe down and turned to her, faintly out of breath. "I need to do something, Miss Ashcombe. I do not like to be idle in another man's house. There is nothing you must do. Then permit me at least to do what I choose." She hesitated. Then she went into the kitchen and came back with a mug of hot water and a little honey and set it on the block beside him. He looked at the mug and then at her and then took it in both hands and drank. "Thank you," he said. "You will make your hands sore," she said. "If you must split wood, you should wear my father's gloves. They are on the peg. I have never been able to work in gloves. You will learn." She said it without smiling. He did not smile either. But something passed between them, small and level, and she found she did not mind, after all, that he had risen before her. In the days that followed, she watched him as she watched everything, without appearing to. He was, she decided, a strange land agent. He did the estate's business. He rode out with her father to look at the boundaries. He sat in the small parlor in the evenings with a leather portfolio open on his knee and made notes in a firm, precise hand. He received short letters from the estate office and answered them by the next post. But he did not behave, in the small hours between business, like a man who spent his life among tenants. He drank his tea, she noticed, without sugar and without milk. He read, in the evenings, from a small dark book he had brought in his traveling case, and she saw once, when he had set it down open on the arm of the parlor chair, that it was in a language she did not know, and that the margins were annotated in a firm, precise hand that matched the hand in which he wrote his letters. He mended, on the second Tuesday, a broken hinge on the pantry door with a small brass screwdriver he took from an inner pocket of the brown coat, a tool no land agent would have carried, though he did not seem to know that she had noticed. He sat at the small kitchen table each evening, facing not the door but the window, as though he had learned somewhere to keep his back to a wall and his eye on a horizon. He did not, for instance, know how to draw water from the well without splashing his boots. He did not know that the milk in the shelf pantry had to be shifted twice a day in cold weather to keep the cream from setting. He did not know how to bank a fire so it would hold through the night. He did not know how to hold a hen so that it would not squawk. But he learned, and he learned, she noticed, without complaint, without impatience, without any of the wounded pride that most men brought to being taught by a woman. He watched her hands. He copied them. He got it wrong. She showed him again. He got it right. He inclined his head to her, once, in a small quiet thanks, and she found herself blushing over a pail of chicken feed and turning quickly away. Prudence, meanwhile, arranged herself. Prudence had never before in her life been an early riser, but by the third morning she was down in the front room in her best cap with a book of poetry laid open on the small table and a fresh ribbon at her throat. She had discovered, by the second breakfast, that Mr. Danvers spoke well, that his manners were extraordinary for a land agent, and that his hands, when he passed the butter, were not the hands of a man who had spent his life on horseback among tenants. He had, she informed her mother in a whisper, the hands of a gentleman. He is a land agent, Prudence, her mother said. So he says, Prudence said. Mrs. Ashcombe, who was not a fool, did not answer this. But her eyes, when they rested on Mr. Danvers across the breakfast table, grew thoughtful. He was courteous to Prudence. He answered her questions about the book of poetry. He listened, with what appeared to be attention, to her opinions on the borrowed novel about the girl and the Viscount. He complimented, once, the ribbon at her throat, not with warmth, but with the correct small politeness one gives to a girl who is trying to be seen. But his eyes, when they rested anywhere in the small kitchen, rested on Nora. Not obviously, not so that Prudence noticed, not so that even Mrs. Ashcombe, watchful as she had grown, could have put it into words. But he watched Nora as she moved, watched her lift the kettle from the hook, watched her cut the bread, watched her cross the yard to the henhouse in her gray dress with the frost in her hair. And when Nora set his plate before him, or filled his cup, or reached across him for the salt, he inclined his head to her in the same small quiet way he had inclined it to her over the pail of chicken feed, as if she were a person, as if she had, in the doing of these small things, done him a kindness he intended to remember. She did not know what to do with it. She had, all her life, been the one who noticed. It was strange, and not entirely comfortable, to be the one noticed in return. At the end of the first week, on a Sunday morning, she came out of the henhouse in the dim before dawn with her apron full of eggs and found him standing at the low stone wall at the edge of the yard, looking out over the frozen low fields toward the crooked oak with the broken branch. She stopped. She would have gone back into the house without a word. She had learned over the years that men standing alone at walls did not, as a rule, wish to be interrupted. But he heard her and turned. "Miss Ashcombe, you are up early. So are you, Mr. Danvers." "I could not sleep." "The bed is not comfortable?" "The bed is entirely comfortable. My thoughts are not." She did not know what to say to that. She stood with her apron of eggs and looked at him. In the dim gray light before dawn his lean face was younger than it was by lamplight, and less guarded. "I was thinking," he said after a moment and turned back to the low fields, "about the crooked oak there, with the broken branch. Do you know why it has never been cut away? My father says a cut branch is a wound. A broken branch is a scar. Scars are stronger than wounds." He was silent. "He says that," she added, "when he does not wish to spend the afternoon on a ladder with a saw." He laughed then, a short, surprised, quiet laugh. It was the first time she had heard him laugh. He turned his face to her, and she saw, for the first time, something like warmth in the gray eyes. "Miss Ashcombe, I did not expect that. I did not expect to say it. Do you often say things you do not expect to say?" "No." "Why now?" She looked down at the apron of eggs. "Because you are the first person," she said quietly, "who has asked me a question in some time." He did not answer for a long moment. When she looked up, he had turned back to the low fields, and his hands were folded on the low stone wall, and he did not look at her. But she saw that his jaw had set, once hard, and then relaxed, as if he had decided something, or unlearned something, or promised something to himself under his breath. Then he said in a very level voice, "I will ask you many questions, Miss Ashcombe, if you will let me." She did not answer. She could not. She turned and went into the kitchen with her apron of eggs, and she did not remember, afterward, laying them in the basket, or shaking the frost from her cap, or filling the kettle. She remembered only the level voice at the low stone wall, and the crooked oak with the broken branch, and her father's saying about scars. 200 miles to the south, in the paneled study of Ashenfell, a second letter went out from the Dowager Duchess. This one was to her son, sent care of the estate office, requesting an immediate response as to the arrangements for the Princess Isabeau's arrival in the spring. The wines to be laid in, the guest rooms to be aired, the neighborhood families to be invited to the welcoming ball. The Dowager was not accustomed to writing twice without an answer. The letter reached Mr. Danvers at Ashcombe on the following Tuesday. He read it standing in the front room by the window, his back to Prudence, who was arranging her ribbons and pretending not to watch him. He read it once. He folded it precisely into thirds. He put it into the inner pocket of his brown coat. He did not answer it. That evening, at the small kitchen table, he asked John Ashcombe about the drainage of the low fields, and about the boundary with the Whitby estate, and about a particular tenant 3 cottages down whose rent had been in arrears for 3 quarters. He made notes in his firm, precise hand. He did not look at Nora across the table. He did not need to. He was aware of her, at the corner where the light did not fall, the way a man is aware of the compass in his pocket even when he is not looking at it. The letter from the Dowager Duchess sat, folded in thirds, in the inner pocket of his brown coat. He would answer it, but not yet. In the second week the frost broke. In the third week the roads were passable again. In the fourth week, the estate office wrote to Mr. Danvers to say that the Whitby boundary dispute could not be settled without a formal consultation at Ashenfell itself, and that he was expected there for 3 days. He rode out on a Monday morning in his brown coat, on his plain bay horse. He returned on a Thursday evening. He was quieter when he returned than he had been when he left. His face was set. His eyes, when they rested on Nora across the kitchen table, rested longer than they had before, and with something in them that had not been there before, something that was not quite pain but was close to it. Nora did not ask. She had learned not to ask. She only made sure, that night, that the fire in the back room was banked properly, and that a fresh jug of water stood on the washstand, and that the shirt he had left folded at the foot of the bed had been aired and pressed. He found the shirt aired and pressed when he came up. He stood a long time by the bed. Then he sat down on the edge of it and put his face in his hands. He understood now, in a position he had not intended to reach. He had come to Ashcombe in a brown coat to look, once, at a girl who had lifted her face to a winter sky. He had intended to look, to satisfy himself that the picture in his mind was only a picture, and to ride away again. He had not intended to be spoken to about scars. He had not intended to be handed a mug of hot water with honey at a woodblock at dawn. He had not intended to be taught how to hold a hen. He had not intended to sit at a small kitchen table in the evenings and feel, for the first time in his adult life, that he was in a room where he did not have to be a duke. He had not intended, above all, to find that the picture in his mind was less than the reality. But he had. And the letter in the inner pocket of his brown coat, sitting now on the chair by the bed, was a princess. He did not sleep that night. In the morning he came down before Nora. He had lit the kitchen fire himself and put the kettle on. He was sitting at the small kitchen table with a cup of hot water and honey when she came in from the yard with the pail. "Miss Ashcombe, Mr. Danvers, you are up early. So are you." "I always am." "I know." She set the pail on the shelf. She hung her shawl on the peg. She washed her hands in the cold basin and dried them on the rough cloth by the door. She turned to the table and saw that he had laid a place for her, opposite him, with a cup of hot water and honey. She stood a moment. Then she sat down. "You have been kind to me, Miss Ashcombe," he said quietly, "in a house where I had no right to expect kindness. I have not thanked you. You have. You inclined your head. That is not thanks. It is from a man who does not give much." He looked at her then, across the small kitchen table, and his gray eyes were very steady. "You see a great deal, Miss Ashcombe, for a girl who is not looked at." She did not answer. She wrapped her red, chapped hands around the cup. "I would ask you a question," he said, "if you will permit it. You said you would ask me many. I meant it. This is the first." Ask. He was silent a moment. Then he said, still very steadily, "If a man came to you, a man of some means, in a position I will not name yet, and offered you his hand, and his house, and the whole of what he had, in exchange for a life in which you would be seen and not overlooked, and asked at the same time your patience because he could not, for a little while, explain to you exactly who he was, would you refuse him? Or would you take his hand?" She did not, at first, understand. Then she did. She set the cup down. Her heart was beating so hard she thought he must hear it. "Mr. Danvers." "Yes." "I do not know what you are." "No, you do not. Not yet. Are you a good man?" "I have tried to be. I have not always succeeded. I am trying now." "Are you married?" "No." "Are you promised?" He did not answer immediately. Then he said, "I have been promised by others. I have not myself promised. And I do not intend to keep any promise that was not mine to give." "Then you are being asked to. By someone who has that right." "I am being asked to. By my mother." "Yes." She was silent a long time. "Mr. Danvers." "Why me?" "Because I saw you," he said, "in a yard in autumn, lifting your face to a winter sky, and I have not, in the 4 months since, been able to see anything else. She looked at her hands on the table. They were red and chapped and small. They did not look, to her, like the hands of a woman a man had ridden 4 months and 200 miles to find. I am a farmer's daughter, Mr. Danvers. I know. I have no dowry. I know. I have no accomplishments. I do not sing. I read only what my sister leaves lying about. I have never been to a ball. I do not know how to be a lady. I know. Then why? Because, he said, everything you have just named as your failings is a language for a life I do not want to live any longer. And everything you have not named, your patience, your competence, the way you looked at the crooked oak with the broken branch and told me the truth about scars, is a language for the life I would like to try. She was silent again. Then, in a very small voice, she said, I do not know your name. Your full name. You will. I will tell you. But not this morning. This morning I ask only whether, if I asked, you would take my hand. She looked up at him. You have not asked. I know. I am telling you first that I mean to, so that you have time. She thought a long time. She thought of her mother's imagined drawing rooms, and Prudence's ribbons, and her father's ledger, and the corner of the table where the light did not fall. She thought of the crooked oak with the broken branch. She thought of a level voice at a low stone wall saying, I will ask you many questions, Miss Ashcombe, if you will let me. Ask, she said, when you are ready, and I will answer when you do. He inclined his head to her. Then he reached, very slowly, across the small kitchen table, and laid one of his hands, palm up, on the wood between them. She looked at the hand. She put her red, chapped hand into it. He closed his fingers once, gently, around hers, and then let her go. They did not speak of it again that day. But that afternoon, a second letter came to Mr. Danvers from the estate office, folded around a third letter from the Dowager Duchess. This third letter was not, this time, a question about wines and guest rooms. It was a summons. The Princess Isabeau, it said, had accepted the invitation. She was already on the road. She would arrive at Ashenfell in 11 days. Mr. Danvers read the letter standing at the low stone wall at the edge of the yard, looking out over the frozen low fields toward the crooked oak with the broken branch. Then he folded the letter into thirds, put it in the inner pocket of his brown coat with the other one, and went into the small parlor of the cottage, where John Ashcombe sat with his ledger by the fire. Mr. Ashcombe, I would ask a private word. John Ashcombe looked up. He was not a stupid man. He had, in the 4 weeks of Mr. Danvers's residence, seen a great many things he had not remarked upon. Sit, he said. Mr. Danvers did not sit. Mr. Ashcombe, I have come here under a name that is not fully mine. I have come under an occupation that is not fully mine. I intend, before the week is out, to tell you and your family the whole of both. I ask your patience only until I have made an arrangement in the South that I cannot, in honor, avoid making. I ask your patience above all because I intend, when I have made that arrangement, to return here and ask for your daughter Nora's hand in marriage. Not Prudence. Nora. There was a long silence. John Ashcombe closed his ledger. You are not a land agent, he said. No. I have known that a fortnight. I supposed you had. Are you a gentleman? I am. Of some property. Of considerable property. Then you will forgive a plain man for asking a plain question. Are you free to marry my daughter? I am free. I am not, at this moment, unpromised. I intend to end that promise honorably before I return. You mean, said John Ashcombe, slowly, that a lady in the South believes herself to be promised to you. Her family believes it. She herself, I hope, will not much regret its end. My mother arranged it in my absence and without my consent. I have not signed. I have not spoken. I have not, in any language of my own, promised. I have only been offered as a piece of furniture in a room I was not in. John Ashcombe looked at his ledger, then at the fire, then at Mr. Danvers. You will ride south. I will ride south. Tomorrow morning. I will be gone a fortnight. I will return and I will tell your family who I am and I will ask for Nora. I ask 2 things of you, that you tell no one until I return, and that you tell Nora, if she asks, only this, that I have not lied to her and that I will come back." John Ashcombe was silent a long time. "You have not asked her yet." "I have told her that I mean to. I have asked whether, if I did, she would answer. She said she would." "Then you are more of a fool than I took you for, Mr. Danvers, and less of one. Go south. Come back. Say what you have to say. My daughter will decide the rest." Mr. Danvers inclined his head, the same small correct bow he had used at the door on the first afternoon, and went upstairs to pack. He rode out at first light the next morning in his brown coat on his plain bay horse. He did not, that morning, come down for the cup of hot water and honey. He left a small folded note on the kitchen table where Nora would find it. She found it before anyone else was awake. It said, in a firm, precise hand, "I have gone south to end a promise that was not mine to make. I will return in a fortnight. Do not doubt me. I will come back. Adi." She folded the note into a very small square and put it inside the bodice of her gray dress, over her heart, where no one would see it. Then she went out to the hen house in the dim before dawn to count the eggs. 200 miles to the south, the Dowager Duchess of Ashenfell stood at the top of the great staircase of Ashenfell and watched a carriage roll up the north avenue between the black trees. The chimneys were smoking. The frost had at last begun to melt. In the carriage was a princess. She did not know that her son, in a brown coat on a plain bay horse, was at that moment riding hard from the north, and that he was coming home with an intention she had not sanctioned and would not, when she heard it, permit. She would find out. He arrived at Ashenfell at dusk on the fourth day, the horse blown, his brown coat white with the dust of the roads, and he did not go around to the stables. He rode up to the front steps and dismounted and gave the horse to a startled groom and walked straight into his own house past a footman who did not, in the brown coat, immediately recognize him. "Your Grace," the footman managed, when he did. "Where is my mother?" "In the great drawing-room, Your Grace. With Her Highness." "Thank you." He crossed the marble hall. He climbed the great staircase in 3 strides at a time. He did not stop at his own rooms. He did not change. He walked, still in the dusty brown coat, still with the boots of a land agent, into the great drawing-room of Ashenfell. The Dowager Duchess rose from her chair. The Princess Isabeau rose from hers. She was, as advertised, 20 years old, perfectly educated, and blonde. She wore rose-colored silk and a small polite smile. "Alaric," said his mother, in a voice that could have cut glass, "you are dressed." "I have come from a long ride, mother." "Forgive me, Your Highness." He bowed to the princess. She inclined her head. Her polite smile did not change, but her eyes, he saw, took in the brown coat and the dust and drew a conclusion. "Your Grace," she said, "your mother has been kind enough to entertain me in your absence. I am glad to see you at last." "Your Highness," he said. He did not sit. "I owe you a very great apology, and a very direct honesty. May I ask my mother to permit us a private moment? Or, if that is not proper, to attend us at some distance?" The Dowager Duchess's face was, at that moment, the color of the paper on which she had written her letters. But she was a woman who understood, better than most, that a scene in front of a princess was worse than any private conversation. "I will retire to the far window," she said, "and observe you both without hearing you." She did. She was, however, a woman who could hear with her eyes, and what she saw was this. Her son standing before the Princess Isabeau of Vaudrey, in a brown coat and the boots of a land agent, speaking to her in a low, steady voice for 11 minutes. The princess listening, first with polite surprise, then with faint amusement, then with something that looked very like relief. The princess, at the end of the 11 minutes, extending one gloved hand to her son and laying it, briefly, on his sleeve, her son bowing over that hand. The princess laughing, once, a low, light laugh, and saying something that made her son smile, genuinely smile, for the first time in years that his mother could remember. Then the princess crossed the room to the Dowager Duchess and sat down opposite her and said, "Quietly, madam, your son has told me the truth about his heart, and I honor him for it. There was, in our arrangement, no formal engagement to break. There was only your kindness in proposing me and my father's kindness in permitting the visit. I believe it will suit us all to say, publicly, that I have declined. The Dowager Duchess stared at her. You have declined. With every appearance of pride and no injury. It will be the finest match I have ever refused, and the story will do me a great deal of good among the crown princes at home, who require, I am told, a little seasoning of unattainability. Your son and I have not deceived each other. He has only spared me from a marriage I would have accepted from duty and he would have kept from duty, and duty, madam, is the worst husband either of us could have taken. She smiled at the Dowager Duchess. It was a small, perfectly polite, ducal-level smile. The Dowager Duchess, who had spent her life training precisely such smiles onto precisely such young women, recognized it and could say nothing. You will stay a week for appearance's sake, said the princess. I will admire the house. I will decline. I will leave. Your son will spend the intervening week in his own rooms writing letters. I believe he has a fortnight's absence to make good on to a young lady in the north. The Dowager Duchess sat very still. The princess turned back to Alaric. Your Grace, I wish you very well. I hope, when I marry, as I shall, and to my own choice, that I am seen as you have described her. Go north. Do not waste the fortnight. Your Highness, he said, and bowed low over her hand. He did not look at his mother. He did not need to. He turned on his heel in his dusty brown coat and left the great drawing-room of Ashenfell, and the Dowager Duchess sat opposite the Princess Isabeau of Vaudrey in a silence so deep it had a texture, and understood, for perhaps the first time in her long formidable life, that her son had grown up without asking her permission. The princess picked up her cup of tea. He is a very fine young man, madam, she said. You have raised him well. Better than either of us intended. The Dowager Duchess did not answer. But when, at the end of the week, the princess had gone, and the house was quiet, and Alaric came to her in the paneled study with the small dark portraits of men who had done well and been remembered for it, she looked at her son standing before her in a plain traveling coat and buff breeches, with a leather portfolio under his arm and his gray eyes very steady on hers, and she said only, Bring her to me. When you have married her, I will meet her. Mother, I did not say I approved. I said I would meet her. That is more than I have said to any other woman in this house, and it is what you asked me for without asking. Go. He inclined his head to her. He went north. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. He arrived at the cottage at Ashcombe at dusk, on a plain bay horse, in a plain brown coat that was no longer exactly a disguise. Nora was in the yard with the milk pail. She turned when she heard the horse. She did not run to him. She did not, as Prudence would have, drop the pail and lift her skirts. She only stood in the middle of the frozen yard in her gray dress, with the milk pail in her hand and the frost in her hair, and she watched him dismount and tie the horse and cross the yard toward her. He stopped a pace short of her. Miss Ashcombe, Mr. Danvers, I have come back. You said you would. He held out his hand. She set the milk pail down at her feet. She put her red, chapped hand into his. There are things, he said, I must tell you. Now, before I speak to your father, tell them, my name is not Danvers alone. It is Alaric Danvers. I am the 7th Duke of Ashenfell. I own the estate. I own the low fields. I own, in a manner I am ashamed to name, the cottage in which you have fed me and taught me to hold a hen. I came here to look, once, at a woman I had seen in a yard in autumn. I intended to look and to ride away. I stayed. I have ended honorably, an arrangement my mother made in my absence. I have come back to ask you now, in front of the crooked oak with the broken branch, whether you will marry me. Not because I am the Duke of Ashenfell, but because I would rather be Mr. Danvers, in a small kitchen where you have laid a place for me opposite you, than any other man in any other house in England. She did not speak. She looked at him a long time. Then she said quietly, You are the Duke. I am. And you have been splitting my father's kindling. I have. And drinking hot water with honey at a woodblock. I have. And holding my mother's hens. Badly. Yes. She was silent again. Then she said, Mr. Danvers. Your Grace. I would like to answer you before you speak to my father. I would like to answer you here at the low stone wall, where you first told me you would ask me many questions. Answer. "Yes," she said. "I will marry you." He did not at once kiss her. He only closed his hand more tightly around hers and bent his forehead to hers, once, very briefly, in the frozen yard. Then he took the milk pail from where she had set it, and carried it into the pantry for her, and set it on the shelf, and turned to face her mother, and her sister Prudence, and her father, and said, in the level voice that had first told her about many questions, "Mr. Ashcombe, Mrs. Ashcombe, Miss Prudence, I owe you the truth of a name, and after the truth a request." He told them. Prudence dropped her ribbon. Mrs. Ashcombe sat down, slowly, on the wooden chair by the fire, and did not, for perhaps the first time in her married life, have anything to say. John Ashcombe looked at his ledger, then at his daughter Nora, then at the man in the brown coat. "You have asked her." "I have." "She has answered." "And?" "She has said yes." John Ashcombe closed the ledger. "Then, Your Grace," he said, "you had better sit down. My wife will need a moment." The marriage was small. It was, by the standards of the 7th Duke of Ashenfell, unforgivably small. It was held in the small parish church 3 miles from the low fields. It was witnessed by John Ashcombe, Mrs. Ashcombe, Prudence in a new ribbon and a very red nose, the parson and the parson's wife. The bride wore a plain gown of pale grey silk that the Duke had sent up from London. She had asked only that it not be white and not be showy, with a simple lace fichu at her throat and long modest sleeves to the wrist. She wore her mother's small pearl brooch, borrowed. She carried no flowers. It was February. There were no flowers to be had. She married him without a tremor. She said her vows in a voice that was not loud but was heard by every soul in the small church. She signed her name, Nora Ashcombe, in the parish register in her careful hand. He signed his name below hers, Alaric Danvers Ashenfell, and closed the book and turned to her and did not, in front of the parson, kiss her. He took her hand. He tucked it into the crook of his arm. He walked her out of the small church into the pale February light, and she was, from that moment, the Duchess of Ashenfell. She did not feel like a duchess. She would not, for some time, feel like a duchess. The feeling would come, not all at once and not from anyone else's hand, but slowly, from her own. They traveled south to Ashenfell in a plain carriage. Alaric had refused a state coach. He had refused outriders. He had refused every one of the small ceremonies his mother, in a series of increasingly icy letters, had proposed. He had said, in his one written reply, that his wife was not a package to be delivered, and that he intended to bring her home in the manner in which he had won her, which was quietly. They arrived at Ashenfell in the last of a pale February afternoon. The great house rose against a sky the color of pewter. The chimneys were smoking. The frost had at last begun to melt from the mullioned windows. The servants were lined along the front steps in their livery, according to strict order of precedence, and the Dowager Duchess of Ashenfell stood at the top of the steps in a gown of dove-gray silk with a black lace shawl arranged across her shoulders. Alaric handed his wife down from the carriage himself. Nora looked up at the great house. It was enormous. It was more enormous than she had allowed herself to imagine. The front doors were higher than the whole front wall of the cottage at Ashcombe. The lowest step of the staircase before her was worn smooth by 3 centuries of Danverses coming and going. The servants' faces were, without exception, correctly blank. She had, at that moment, one clear thought. "I do not know how to be this." Then Alaric's hand, on hers, closed once, gently, and he leaned down very briefly and said in her ear, "You do not have to be anything except what you already are. That is what I brought you here to be." She looked up at him. She lifted her chin. She walked up the steps of Ashenfell at his side, in her grey traveling gown, with her red chapped hand in his, and she stopped one step below the Dowager Duchess and dropped a plain, correct curtsy. The Dowager Duchess looked at her a long time. Then she said, in the voice of a woman who had spent 40 years learning to speak in exact weights, "Duchess, welcome to Ashenfell." She did not embrace her. She did not kiss her. She did not smile. But she had used, in front of every servant on the steps, the word Duchess. That, Nora understood, young as she was, invisible as she had been, was, from this woman, the beginning of something. The Dowager Duchess turned. She led them into the house. The doors closed behind them. The first month at Ashenfell was cold. It was not cold from Alaric. It was cold from the house itself, from the servants, from the neighborhood, and, most exquisitely, from the Dowager Duchess. The Dowager Duchess had, that first evening, sat opposite Nora at the enormous mahogany dining table that ran the length of the great dining room. The table was set for 3 at one end, with 3 footmen behind 3 chairs, in a room designed for 40. The candles burned in silver branches. The plates were gold-rimmed. The soup was served in a tureen that had been in the family since the reign of King George II. The Dowager Duchess had lifted her spoon. Nora, opposite her, had lifted hers. Alaric, at the head of the table, had lifted his. The Dowager Duchess had, without appearing to look at Nora at all, spoken to Alaric about the tenants of the North Farms, the state of the North Road, the health of the neighborhood bishop, the recent conduct of the local magistrate, and the marriages, births, and deaths of every one of the 8 neighboring families with whom the Danvers of Ashenfell were on visiting terms. Nora had eaten her soup. She had not spoken. She had listened. She had, in the course of the meal, learned the name of every family, the age and unmarried status of every daughter, the debts and standings of every son, and the health of every dowager between here and the border. She had committed each to memory in the careful, patient way she had committed to memory, in her mother's kitchen, the placement of every jug and pan. The Dowager Duchess did not, at any point in the meal, address her directly. At the end of the meal, when the last plate had been cleared and the last footman had withdrawn, the Dowager Duchess had risen from her chair, inclined her head to Alaric, and said, "I shall retire. Duchess, I will see you at breakfast at 8:30. It is early. I do not know what hours you keep." 8:30 is not early, madam, Nora had said. "I shall be in the yard before it." The Dowager Duchess had, for the first time that evening, turned her full attention on her daughter-in-law. "There are no yards here, Duchess. There are gardens." "Then I shall be in the gardens, madam." The Dowager Duchess had inclined her head, a fraction of a fraction, and left the room. Alaric had waited until the door closed. Then he had reached across the corner of the enormous mahogany table for his wife's hand. She had let him take it. "She will thaw," he said quietly. "She does not need to. I have not come to be loved by her." "Then why have you come?" She thought a long moment. "To be sure," she said, "that you are not eating alone at this table." He looked at her. Then he lifted her hand to his mouth and kissed the red, chapped back of it, and said nothing. The house was too large. That was the first difficulty. Nora, who had spent her adult life in a cottage of 4 rooms and a pantry, discovered in her first week at Ashenfell that she could walk for 11 minutes at an ordinary pace in one direction along the great corridors without turning back, and still be in the house. There were rooms she had never entered. There were rooms Alaric had never entered. There were rooms which, so far as either of them could establish, had not been entered since his grandfather's death. She began quietly to enter them. She did not do it as a duchess would have. She did not do it with a housekeeper at her elbow and a footman behind. She rose before the servants, in the way she had always risen, and she walked the corridors in a plain gray morning dress with her hair simply pinned, and she opened doors. She found, in the west wing, a small library with a broken shutter and a smell of damp. She had the shutter mended. She had the room aired. She began, in the afternoons, after the Dowager Duchess had retired to write her letters, to sit in it with a book. She found, in the north wing, a music room in which a harpsichord stood under a dustcloth. She lifted the dustcloth. She did not know how to play. She did not have it moved. She had it cleaned. She left the dustcloth folded on a chair beside it. Alaric, passing the door one afternoon on his way to his study, saw the folded cloth and stood a long moment looking at the harpsichord as if he did not entirely recognize it, and then walked on without a word. She found, in the east wing, a small sewing room in which a chair by the window had a worn cushion in the exact shape of a person who had sat in it for many hours. She sat in it. Fitted her. She began, at the end of her walks, to keep small notes in her plain hand of what each room needed. A shutter mended, a hinge oiled, a curtain rehung, a candlestick straightened. She left the notes in the housekeeper's small parlor on a shelf beside the housekeeper's ledger. She did not sign them. The housekeeper, a formidable woman named Mrs. Calendar, who had served the Danvers of Ashenfell for 31 years and had, on the first evening, curtsied to Nora with an expression of neutral pain, found the notes on the third morning, read them and did not speak of them. But over the following week the shutter was mended, the hinge was oiled, the curtain was rehung, and the candlestick was straightened. And on the 8th morning, when Nora came into the housekeeper's small parlor with a new note, Mrs. Calendar was already there. She did not curtsy. She looked at the new Duchess a long moment. Then she said, "Your Grace, I have served this house 31 years. I have received many mistresses. I have received few notes. I did not mean to trespass on your work, Mrs. Calendar. You have not trespassed. You have observed. I ask permission to observe with you." Nora looked at her. "Mrs. Calendar, I would be grateful." Mrs. Calendar inclined her head, the first inclination Nora had received in that house from anyone other than her husband, and, from that morning, walked the corridors with the new Duchess in the early hours before the Dowager Duchess rose. It was Mrs. Calendar who told her, on the second walk, about the small round table. The great dining table of Ashenfell, the enormous mahogany table set for 40, was, Mrs. Calendar explained, the formal table of the house. There was also, in a small breakfast parlor on the south side, a plainer table, mahogany also, but round and small enough to seat 6. It had been the breakfast table of the 5th Duke and his wife. They had used it for 40 years. The 6th Duke, Alaric's father, had not used it. He had preferred the great table even at breakfast alone. The small round table had been covered with a linen cloth and pushed into a corner of the breakfast parlor and used as a stand for a large blue and white porcelain vase. Nora went that afternoon to the breakfast parlor. She lifted the vase. She lifted the linen cloth. She stood a long time looking at the small round mahogany table. That evening, she asked Alaric a quiet question over the enormous mahogany dining table. "Would you very much mind," she said, "if we were to take our breakfasts at the small round table in the south parlor? Just the two of us. In the mornings before your mother comes down." He set down his glass. He looked at her a long time. "I have not sat at that table," he said, "since I was 7 years old. You need not sit at it now if you would rather not." "Nora, yes, I would like very much to sit at that table." She inclined her head to him, the small correct inclination she had learned, without knowing she was learning it, from him, and the following morning at 7 o'clock, she came down to a breakfast parlor in which the vase had been moved, the linen cloth folded, and the small round mahogany table set with 2 places, opposite one another, at a distance no wider than the small kitchen table at Ashcombe. He came in 10 minutes later. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at the table. Then he crossed the parlor and sat down opposite her and reached, once, across the small round table for her hand, and did not, for perhaps the first time in his adult life at Ashenfell, feel that he was eating alone. They kept the small round table. It became, without anyone in the house speaking of it, the marker of the house's slow thaw. The Dowager Duchess did not, at first, come down to it. She continued to take her breakfast in her own rooms. She continued to appear only at the enormous mahogany dining table at 9, correctly dressed, correctly cold. She continued to address Nora only when necessary, and only in the smallest weight of the smallest word. But on the 4th week, she came down at 8. She stopped in the doorway of the breakfast parlor. She looked at the small round table. She looked at her son and her daughter-in-law seated opposite one another at it in the plain morning light. She looked at the linen cloth folded on the chair by the wall. She did not speak. Alaric rose. Nora rose. "Mother." "Sit down, Alaric. I have not come to eat. I have come to observe. Continue your breakfast." She crossed to the window and sat on the small sofa by the glass, in her dove-gray silk, with her back very straight, and she watched them. She watched Nora pour Alaric's coffee. She watched Nora pass him the small dish of preserved fruit. She watched Nora spread butter on his toast without being asked, and hand it to him with the buttered side toward him, and watch him eat it. She watched her son, whom she had known his entire life, laugh once, quietly with his eyes, at something his wife had said in a voice too low for the dowager to catch. She watched them a long time. Then she said, "From the sofa, Duchess. I have been advised by Mrs. Callender that you have taken an interest in the West Library and the North Music Room." "I have, madam. There is, in the south wing, a small conservatory in which the plants have died. The plants died in my mother-in-law's time. I have not entered the room in 22 years. I would be obliged if you would enter it and tell me what you find." Nora looked at her mother-in-law. "I shall enter it this afternoon, madam. You will report to me at 4. "I shall report to you at 4. The Dowager Duchess rose from the sofa. She inclined her head the same fraction of a fraction and left the room. Alaric, opposite Nora at the small round table, did not speak. But he lifted her hand across the table, once, briefly, and kissed the back of it. "Nora." "Yes, that was a summons." "I know. She has not summoned anyone to a report in 6 years." "I know." He set down her hand. "Go carefully." "I will." She went carefully. The small conservatory in the south wing was a beautiful ruin. Its plants had died. Its glass was clouded. Its wrought iron benches were streaked with rust. Its floor, of small black and white tiles in a pattern of interlocking octagons, was cracked in 3 places. It smelled of old damp and old sun. She stood in the middle of it for a long time. She did not think at that moment of the Dowager Duchess. She did not think of the report at 4. She thought, instead, of a small conservatory a very old woman had loved, and had left, and had not been able to come back to. At 4 o'clock, she stood in the Dowager Duchess's private sitting room in the West Wing and reported. She reported what she had found. She reported what could be salvaged and what could not. She reported the cost, approximately, of replanting and reglazing. She reported the names of 2 of the plants that had died. She had recognized them by the shapes of their old leaves in the pots, and observed that both had been favorites of country gardens 40 years earlier, and might, if replanted, be pleasant against the current fashion for hothouse orchids. The Dowager Duchess listened without moving. When Nora had finished, the Dowager Duchess said only, "Do it, madam. You will do it. I will pay for it. You will not consult me on the details. You will invite me to see it when it is finished. That is all, madam." Nora inclined her head. She turned to leave. At the door, the Dowager Duchess said, very quietly, without looking at her, "Duchess, madam, how did you know they were her favorites?" Nora paused, with her hand on the door. "The pots, madam. They were the plainest pots in the room. The others were fashionable. Those 2 were plain. She had chosen those 2 herself." The Dowager Duchess did not answer. Nora went out and closed the door quietly behind her. The conservatory took 11 weeks to restore. It was done by the middle of May. It was done under Nora's quiet direction, with the help of 2 men from the estate garden and 1 woman from the village whose grandmother, it turned out, had known the Dowager Duchess's mother-in-law and remembered the names of the plants. It was done without a single instruction from the Dowager Duchess and without a single visit from her. On the day it was finished, a bright warm day of the sort that only late May can produce in the north of England, Nora sent word to the Dowager Duchess by Mrs. Callender that the conservatory was ready to be seen at her convenience. The Dowager Duchess came at once. She stood in the doorway a long moment. The glass had been reglazed. The floor had been mended and washed. The wrought iron benches had been rust-brushed and painted a pale soft green. The plants, a great many of them, chosen from country gardens and small nurseries within 30 miles, filled the beds and the pots and the corners with a soft, unshowy, unfashionable abundance. In the center, in the plainest of the old pots, restored with care, stood a single specimen of each of the 2 favorites, tall and healthy and quiet. The Dowager Duchess entered the conservatory. She walked its length once, slowly. She stopped, at last, in front of the 2 plain pots. She stood a long time. She did not speak. She did not turn. When she did turn, her face was, for once, not the face of the Dowager Duchess of Ashenfell. It was the face of a woman who had been, once, a young bride in this house and had been, once, permitted by an older woman to sit in this room, and had lost, at some point in the long slow decades between then and now, the memory of that permission. She crossed the floor to Nora. She stopped 1 pace short of her. She said, in a voice that was quite steady, "I did not think you would remember the pots." "I remembered, madam." "You remembered?" "Yes." She was silent a moment. Then she said, "Duchess, my son married you against my counsel. I have not, until this moment, forgiven him for it. I forgive him now. I ask, in return, that you forgive me for having required forgiveness at all." Nora looked at her mother-in-law. She said quietly, "There is nothing to forgive, madam. You have used the word duchess to me since I stood on your steps. I have never doubted where you placed me." The Dowager Duchess inclined her head. It was, this time, not a fraction of a fraction. It was a full inclination. Then she did something she had not, in Nora's presence, ever done. She reached out one gloved hand and laid it, briefly, against Nora's cheek. The only tenderness she permitted herself and anyone, and Nora did not turn her head, but let her hand rest there. And then she withdrew her hand and left the conservatory without another word. That evening, at the enormous mahogany dining table, the Dowager Duchess spoke to Nora directly for the first time in the ordinary flow of conversation, without ceremony, about the state of the North Road. Alaric, at the head of the table, poured his wife's wine himself. The thaw of Ashenfell was, from that evening, complete. But the thaw of Ashenfell was not, unfortunately, the thaw of the neighborhood. The neighborhood, when it discovered that the 7th Duke of Ashenfell had married not the Princess Isabeau of Vaudrey but a farmer's daughter from his own low fields, had received the news in the manner of a house receiving cold water through an open window. It had gasped. It had complained. It had, in a great many drawing rooms within a great many miles, expressed its concern for the Dowager Duchess and its sympathy for the neighborhood's most eligible bachelor, who had clearly been imposed upon. The imposition, in the neighborhood's telling, had a name. It was Lady Cordelia Whitby. Lady Cordelia Whitby was 24 years old. She was the only daughter of the Earl of Whitby, whose estate marched with Ashenfells along the disputed boundary. Alaric had ostensibly, in his brown coat, come north to consider. She was beautiful in a way that photographs, had photographs then existed, would have flattered without needing to enhance. She was accomplished. She played the harpsichord. She sang. She rode. She read Latin, though not, she thought privately, quite as well as the Princess Isabeau of Vaudrey, whom she despised on principle without ever having met. She had, for 6 years, considered herself to be, if not the presumptive Duchess of Ashenfell, then at least the most obvious candidate. She had ridden out with Alaric. She had danced with him. She had, on one occasion after a hunt supper, contrived to be alone with him in an alcove of the neighboring Earl's gallery for fully 3 minutes. He had, on that occasion, bowed to her and gone to fetch her mother. She had thought at the time that this was gallantry. She had, in fact, been rejected. She simply had not known it. She knew it now. She knew it, and she had spent the 11 weeks of the conservatory's restoration turning that knowledge, slowly and precisely, into something she could use. Her cruelty, for it was cruelty, though she did not yet name it that even to herself, did not begin as cruelty. It began as small backhanded remarks, dropped over teacups, in the drawing rooms of the 8 neighborhood families. The new Duchess, poor thing, could hardly help her origins. It was so kind of the Dowager Duchess to receive her. One did wonder whether she would ever be quite comfortable with a fish fork. And so on, small and quiet, the way water gets into an old wall. Then, when the neighborhood at large began, at first tentatively and then with growing warmth, to receive the new Duchess, because Nora, being quiet and observant and slow to speak, gave the neighborhood nothing to catch her out on, the small backhanded remarks became something sharper. There were, in the 3rd week of Nora's calls, questions dropped at her within earshot. Whether her father, the tenant, would attend her at the Ashenfell midsummer ball. Whether her sister, Prudence, was to be presented. Whether it was true that she had, before her marriage, herself carried the milk pail across the yard. The questions were not always addressed to Nora. They were sometimes, more devastatingly, addressed to the Dowager Duchess, in Nora's presence. Nora bore this with the patience she had bought, at a small kitchen table where the light did not fall, over 22 years. The Dowager Duchess did not. The Dowager Duchess, at the 3rd such question in the 3rd such drawing room, had turned her full formidable attention on the questioner. A certain Mrs. Millfield, wife of a neighboring baronet, and had said, in the exact weight of her most exact voice, "My daughter-in-law carried, in the yard of her father's cottage, the milk pail she now carries, in this drawing-room, the reputation of the House of Ashenfell. If Mrs. Millfield is concerned for the milk pail, she may inquire of my son's steward. If Mrs. Millfield is concerned for the reputation of the House of Ashenfell, she may inquire of me. The two are the same errand." The room had gone silent. Mrs. Millfield had not, for the remainder of the visit, ventured another question. But Lady Cordelia Whitby, who had been sitting in the corner of that drawing-room in a gown of pale rose silk, had noted the exchange and had understood, with the small clear cold clarity that governed all her decisions, that a war fought in drawing-rooms would not be won. She would need a larger room. The larger room was the Ashenfell Midsummer Ball. The Ashenfell Midsummer Ball had been given, every year for 4 generations, on the longest evening of the year. It had been suspended, for 2 years after the 6th Duke's death and Alaric's succession, and not resumed. The Dowager Duchess, who had loved the ball in her youth and had come to associate it with her husband's slow decline in his last years, had preferred, once she was widowed, not to reopen the great ballroom. She reopened it that year. She reopened it, she told Alaric quietly one evening in her sitting room, because a new duchess should be presented, once in the room in which every previous Duchess of Ashenfell had been presented, and because the neighborhood should be given, once and for all, the opportunity to receive her formally or to identify itself as unwilling to. Alaric had looked at his mother a long moment. "You will make her a target, mother. Half the county will use it to bait her. Half the county will use anything to bait her, Alaric. It is better to be baited under our own chandeliers than in someone else's drawing-room. If she is to be Duchess here, let her be presented as Duchess here, and let those who do not receive her identify themselves. I will manage the seating. She will manage her own composure. You will manage yourself." He had inclined his head. The invitations had gone out. The neighborhood had accepted. Every one of the 8 families. Every one of the surrounding 15. The Earl and Countess of Whitby, and their daughter, the Lady Cordelia Whitby, had accepted, in a gilt-edged hand, by return post. The ballroom of Ashenfell had, for 11 weeks after the conservatory was finished, been the small project of 2 of the estate's carpenters, 3 of the housemaids, Mrs. Callender and the new Duchess. The chandeliers had been lowered and washed piece by piece. The great floor had been repolished. The long mirrors along the north wall had been reframed. The musicians' gallery had been rehung with pale gold silk. The great doors had been rehung on their hinges so that they no longer, as they had for 6 years, made a small tired scraping noise when a footman opened them. On the longest evening of the year at 8 o'clock, in a gown of pale gray silk with a fine silver embroidery at the hem and long modest sleeves to the wrist, with a small string of pearls at her throat, the Dowager Duchess's own, given to her 3 days before the ball, without ceremony, in the west sitting room, Nora Danvers, 7th Duchess of Ashenfell, stood at the top of the great staircase beside her husband and her mother-in-law and waited to receive the neighborhood. She did not choose the gray by accident. She chose it because gray had been her mother's mockery and her father's ledger and the corner of the table where the light did not fall, and because gray was the color of a woman who did not need to compete with the pale rose silk she knew, without being told, that Lady Cordelia Whitby would wear. She would not compete. She would only, this evening, be seen. The Earl and Countess of Whitby were announced. They ascended the great staircase. They curtsied and bowed. Lady Cordelia Whitby, behind them, in a gown of pale rose silk with elaborate blush-colored roses embroidered at the bodice and a diamond clip in her hair, curtsied more deeply than was strictly required, and rose with a small, perfectly correct, perfectly polite smile. "Your Grace," she said to Nora, "how lovely you look. Gray is such a sensible choice." "Thank you, Lady Cordelia," Nora said quietly. "It is a color that has served me well." Lady Cordelia's smile did not change. She inclined her head and passed on into the ballroom on her father's arm. The Dowager Duchess, beside Nora, did not appear to have noticed the exchange. But that night, at a moment before the first dance, when the ballroom was full and the musicians were tuning and the neighborhood was arranged in bright silks along the walls, the Dowager Duchess laid one gloved hand briefly on her daughter-in-law's arm and said, in a voice too low for anyone else to hear, That was well done. Do not, whatever happens tonight, raise your voice to her. She will do that for herself. Nora looked at her mother-in-law. Madam, go dance with your husband. Nora danced with her husband. She had learned, in the 11 weeks of the ballroom's preparation, the 4 dances of the evening's opening set. She had learned them from Alaric himself in the empty ballroom in a plain morning dress, with Mrs. Calendar at the harpsichord. Mrs. Calendar, it emerged, had played passably in her youth, and with no one else present. She had learned them without shame and without hurry, in the same patient way she had learned everything else in her life, and she had learned them well. She was not, on the floor with Alaric, the most graceful dancer in the room. Lady Cordelia Whitby was the most graceful dancer in the room. But Nora was, unmistakably, the woman with whom the Duke of Ashenfell was dancing, and the Duke of Ashenfell danced with her as if there was, in the whole of the county of Ashenfell, no other woman on the floor. The neighborhood watched. The neighborhood, at the end of the first set, adjusted itself. By the third set, Nora had danced with the Earl of Whitby, the neighboring baronet Sir Frederick Millfield, the local magistrate, and Mrs. Calendar's husband, a genial retired cavalry officer whose presence at the ball had been, that afternoon, at the Dowager Duchess's private insistence. She had received, on each dance, a small correct bow and a small correct exchange. She had returned each in her plain gray gown, with the small correct grace of a woman who had learned, over 22 years, to be looked at without flinching. By the 5th set, the neighborhood had made up its mind. The neighborhood, which had come to be entertained, had, in the course of 2 hours, been quietly persuaded, not by any single act but by the accumulation of many small ones, that the new duchess was, in fact, a duchess. Not a farmer's daughter in a fine dress, a duchess in a plain one. Lady Cordelia Whitby understood this by the 6th set. She had danced twice, correctly, with 2 of the neighborhood's most eligible young men, and had received, on both occasions, the polite correct pleasure of a young woman still admired. But she had understood, in the exact clear cold way that governed all her decisions, that the room had turned. She had been the presumptive Duchess of Ashenfell for 6 years. She had been, at 8 o'clock, still the presumptive challenger. She was, at 10 o'clock, becoming, quietly, without malice, without anyone speaking of it, the disappointed one. She would not be the disappointed one. At the beginning of the 7th set, in the interval between the dances, she crossed the ballroom on her father's arm to the small dais on which stood the Duke and Duchess of Ashenfell, the Dowager Duchess, the parson and his wife, and one older gentleman, a certain Mr. Trelawney, an antiquarian and family friend, who had been invited from the south to see the restored conservatory. She curtsied to the Duke. "Your Grace, I wonder if I might beg of you a very great favor. My father has told me that the Dowager Duchess has permitted the great gallery to be reopened this evening for the guests to view the family portraits, and I have never before seen them in their proper hanging. Might I be permitted to walk through the gallery on your arm before the next set?" Alaric looked at her a long moment. He was, as everyone in the room afterward agreed, perfectly courteous. "Lady Cordelia, nothing would please me more than to walk you through the gallery. My wife, however, has not yet seen the portraits herself in their new lighting. We had reserved the interval for that. Perhaps, if you would do us the honor, we 3 might walk it together." Lady Cordelia inclined her head. "I could not intrude on so tender a private tour, Your Grace." "You do not intrude, Lady Cordelia. You are invited." She hesitated, once. Then she smiled her small correct polite smile. "You are gracious as always, Your Grace." She took his arm on one side. Nora took his arm on the other. The 3 of them walked, together, off the ballroom floor toward the great gallery. The Dowager Duchess, watching them go, said quietly to Mr. Trelawney beside her, "That is the trap set." "Whose trap, madam?" "Hers. My son will spring it in 10 minutes. Watch the doorway." Mr. Trelawney watched the doorway. In the great gallery, in the soft light of the newly cleaned chandeliers, the portraits of 6 generations of Danvers of Ashenfell looked down from the walls in their heavy gilt frames. Alaric led both women, at a slow, ordinary pace, along the north wall. He spoke correctly about each portrait: the 3rd Duke who had ridden with Marlborough, the 4th Duke who had refused to, the fifth Duchess, whose small round mahogany table now stood in the south breakfast parlor. The sixth Duke, his father, whose portrait he did not linger over. Lady Cordelia listened with the perfect attention of a woman who has spent 6 years training herself to appear interested in whatever the Duke of Ashenfell said. At the end of the north wall, at a corner where the light fell fully on the small dark portrait of the second Duchess of Ashenfell, a woman who had, according to family tradition, brought a great inheritance to the family and had never been permitted, by her husband, to speak of her own family in his presence. Lady Cordelia paused. She turned to Alaric. "Your Grace, may I speak to you at last of a matter that troubles me? Not in reproach, only in friendship." He inclined his head. "Lady Cordelia, it has come to my attention, I would not raise it, only that the neighborhood has begun to speak of it, and I do not wish it spoken of behind your back, that there is a debt of some considerable amount owed by your father-in-law to a merchant in the market town. I have seen the paper. I have it, in fact, in my father's carriage tonight, having been offered it by the merchant this morning for consideration. He wishes it paid. He has been unable to secure payment. He is a persistent man. He intends, if it is not paid by the end of the week, to have your father-in-law summoned before the magistrate, my father, for public examination. I raise it now, in private, so that you may take the matter in hand before the neighborhood is treated to the spectacle of your wife's father being examined in open court." The great gallery was very quiet. Nora, on Alaric's other arm, did not move. Alaric did not move. Then he said quietly, "Lady Cordelia, you have gone to considerable trouble. I have done what any friend of the House of Ashenfell would do. You have done more than any friend of the House of Ashenfell would do. May I ask what you paid the merchant this morning for the paper?" Lady Cordelia's small, correct, polite smile faltered, for perhaps half a second. I did not, of course, pay the paper. I merely took possession of it. For consideration. You took possession of it. For consideration. To bring to my ball. Where you have offered it to me. Where, if I understand you correctly, you have offered to sell it to me. In the great gallery of my own house, on the arm of my own wife, in the interval of my own dance. Have I understood you correctly, Lady Cordelia? Your Grace, have I understood you correctly? She was silent. Then, very quietly, she said, "You have." He inclined his head to her. "Then I thank you, Lady Cordelia, for your friendship. I will not require the paper. I have already paid the merchant 3 weeks ago, for the entirety of my father-in-law's account with him. I paid it because the merchant is an honest man who was owed his money, and because my father-in-law had been, in that season, Illinois. I paid it because that is what a son-in-law does. The paper you carry in your father's carriage is, therefore, a false paper, sold to you by a dishonest man for a purpose I now understand to have been your purpose. I am afraid you have been imposed upon." He turned to Nora. "Duchess, would you be so kind as to send word to Mr. Callender that Lady Cordelia's carriage is required immediately? Her father, I fear, will not wish her to remain to dance the 8th set." Nora inclined her head. "Your Grace." She turned and walked, in her plain gray silk gown, without hurry, back through the great gallery toward the ballroom. Lady Cordelia Whitby stood a moment longer beside the Duke of Ashenfell, in the soft light of the newly cleaned chandeliers, beneath the small dark portrait of the second Duchess of Ashenfell, who had never been permitted to speak of her own family. Then she said, in a voice that was not entirely her own, "Your Grace, have I your leave to withdraw? You have Lady Cordelia, and you have my last word on this matter, which is this. I chose her not for her dowry, because she has none. I chose her not for her rank, because she has none. I chose her not for the neighborhood's approval, because I did not require it. I chose her for the way she carried a milk pail across a frozen yard in the autumn of last year, and for the way she has, in the 6 months since, carried my house. If you had, on this arm, in your 6 years, ever carried anything but your own ambition, you would not, tonight, be in the position in which you find yourself. Good evening, Lady Cordelia." He bowed. She did not curtsy in return. She turned and walked, alone, out of the great gallery. He stood a long moment beneath the portrait of the second Duchess of Ashenfell. Then he turned and walked back to the ballroom, and to the dais, and to his wife. The Dowager Duchess, receiving him, did not ask, The neighborhood, glancing at the doorway, saw Lady Cordelia Whitby's departure and drew, without instruction, the correct conclusion. The Earl and Countess of Whitby, receiving a private word from Mr. Calendar in the anteroom, gathered their things with correct expressionless faces and left before the 8th set. By the 9th set, the neighborhood had, without anyone speaking of it, closed ranks around the 7th Duchess of Ashenfell. By the 10th set she was unmistakably and finally theirs. At the end of the 11th set, Alaric came to the dais and offered her his arm and led her, past the neighborhood in their bright silks, out through the great doors of the ballroom, along the corridor, down the great staircase, and out through the small side door at the base of it, into the garden. The garden was warm. The longest evening of the year was drawing at last toward its end. The sky above the manor was a deep still lavender. Somewhere in the direction of the low fields, a wood owl was calling. He walked her, without hurry, to the small stone bench in the corner of the garden beneath a rose that had, that afternoon, begun to bloom. He seated her on the bench. He did not sit. He stood in front of her. Then he said quietly, in the level voice she had first heard at a low stone wall at the edge of a frozen yard, "Nora, yes, I chose you not for your dowry, because you had none. I chose you not for your rank, because you had none. I chose you not for the approval of my mother, because I did not have it. I chose you not for the approval of my neighborhood, because I have never sought it. I chose you for the way you carried a milk pail across a frozen yard in an autumn I had not asked to remember. I chose you for the crooked oak with the broken branch and the truth about scars. I chose you for the small round table you laid me a place at in a room that had been shut up since I was 7 years old. I chose you because you were seen even and especially when you thought you were invisible. And I would choose you at every ball, in every gallery, in every house of every county in England, again and again and again." She looked up at him. She did not, at first, speak. Then she said, very quietly, "Alaric, yes, you have chosen me. I have chosen you also." He knelt, then, in the warm grass in front of the stone bench, and laid his forehead against her knee, and did not speak. She placed one hand, the hand that was no longer red, and no longer chapped and had been, in the 6 months since her marriage, in a kitchen where the light did not fall on the corner of the table for the last time, on the back of his dark head, and held it there, and heard the wood owl calling and thought of nothing. Presently he rose. He sat beside her on the bench. He took her hand. They watched the light go slowly out of the sky. A year later, in a warm afternoon of the following June, in the small round breakfast parlor at Ashenfell, 3 people sat at the small round mahogany table. Alaric at one place, Nora at another, and opposite Nora, in a plain gray traveling gown with a fine silver embroidery at the hem and long modest sleeves to the wrist, the Dowager Duchess of Ashenfell. The great mahogany dining room down the corridor was not being used. It had not been used for daily meals in 11 months. It was used now only for large formal occasions, and for the neighborhood dinners at which the 7th Duchess of Ashenfell entertained the Whitbys, and the Millfields, and the 6 other neighborhood families, all of whom, including the newly humbled Lady Cordelia Whitby, presently engaged to a modest baronet from 3 counties over, had, in the year since the midsummer ball, learned to enter the great dining room of Ashenfell with genuine warmth toward its mistress. But daily the family sat at the small round table. On the sideboard behind the Dowager Duchess stood a folded letter. It had come that morning from the Lowfields, from John Ashcombe, tenant of the Lowfields, though the tenancy had, 6 months earlier, been quietly converted into a freehold in his name, without ceremony and without an accompanying letter of thanks that he might have felt obliged to refuse. The letter reported the health of the family, the state of the harvest, and the news that Prudence had, at last, become engaged to a curate in the neighboring parish, a young man of good sense and no dramatic prospects, whom she loved and who loved her, and whom Nora, on her last visit, had liked very much. At the small round table, Nora was pouring the Dowager Duchess's tea. The Dowager Duchess accepted the cup. She looked, once, at her daughter-in-law across the small round table, and said, in the exact weight of her most exact voice, "Duchess, I hear that the small library in the West Wing has been used, this spring, by the vicar's daughters." "As, madam, I invited them. They had no lending library within 11 miles, and their father could not spare his own. And I hear you have permitted the miller's boy to use the old drawing master's copybooks from the attic. I have, madam. He drew a horse on the back of a shopping account. The horse was better than the account. And I hear you have, in the small conservatory, replanted the 2 plain pots this year again. I have, madam. They did not last the winter. I did not tell you until now, because I did not wish you to think I could not keep them. The Dowager Duchess set her cup down. She looked, for a long moment, at Nora. Then she said quietly, Duchess, you were seen. Even when you thought you were invisible, you are seen now, and you will be seen in this house, and in this county, long after I am not. Nora inclined her head. Alaric, at his place, did not speak, but he reached across the small round mahogany table for his wife's hand, and, opposite him, his mother reached at the same moment across the small round mahogany table for her daughter-in-law's other hand, and Nora sat between them at the small round table, with a hand in each of theirs, and looked out through the mullioned window at the June garden, and at the crooked oak that had been transplanted, at her request, from the low fields at Ashcombe, and set into the lawn at Ashenfell, and now, in June of its first year in the new soil, was in full leaf, with the broken branch still uncut and unhealed, and stronger, exactly as her father had said, than any wound. If you have loved this story, stay for another, of a marquis who took a governess's position in his own great house to see with his own eyes the woman his uncle had chosen for him, and of the quiet governess who taught him, without knowing his name, everything he had not been taught in 28 years of being a marquis. That story will be waiting for you next. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.